All right, we are going to start talking about animals now. We've kind of finally arrived at the chapter where we get to discuss things that you're probably very familiar with. So we're going to look at some of the key characteristics of animals and some of the major groups within the kingdom Animalia, and we'll talk about body plans in regards to their symmetry and what that means for the organisms, and also segmentation. So we're going to start out by just kind of overall, what is an animal? So we're still under the domain eukarya. So they are comprised of eukaryotic cells. And once again, we want to kind of stress that these are different from our protozoans that we've talked about, although they may have descended from some type of protozoan ancestor. But these are multicellular organisms that we're looking at. And what sets the animals apart is their mode of gaining energy once again. So instead of being an autotroph like a plant, which we said an autotroph was a self-feeder, they're capable of producing food for themselves, animals are heterotrophs. Hetero means that they rely upon other organisms for their energy and their carbon sources. So heterotrophs eat other organisms, in other words. Now, unlike the fungi, which was also relying upon other organisms for its food, but it was mainly feeding off of kind of dead organisms and doing an external digestion where it was secreting digestive enzymes onto its food source, heterotrophs have an ingestion. They ingest their food and then break it down inside the digestive system. So we see much more advanced organ systems within the animals. So we're going to talk about the phylum Chordata. So we finally arrived at the phylum that we are classified under. So this phylum consists of 2 invertebrate subphyla and a vertebrate subphyla. So if we go back to the kind of our evolutionary tree, we see that chordates have branched off from the echinoderms. And so the echinoderms were kind of along that deuterostome development there. And like the echinoderms, chordates are deuterostomes, and we are very closely related to the sea stars and the sea urchins as compared to the rest of the animal phyla. But echinoderms and chordate groups, they split very early on, and they have remained distinct groups for at least 500 million years. So echinoderms and chordates are still vastly different, as you can tell just by looking at them. So this phyla contains organisms such as tunicates and lancelets, which are invertebrates, but also includes the cats and the dogs and the birds and the fish and the frogs and whales and elephants, and everything like that falls under the phylum Chordata. So as you can see, there's a wide array of organisms that fall in this group. So to be a chordate means that you have these 4 chordate characteristics. So we are looking at having a dorsal notochord. So the notochord is the structure for which chordates are named for. A notochord is a flexible rod that's located between the digestive tract and the nerve cord, and it extends through most of the length of the animal and acts as a simple skeleton. So the notochord was actually derived from the mesoderm. Remember your germ tissue layers. So it's important because it provides a place of attachment for muscles, and the notochord itself is usually comprised of large fluid-filled cells that are enclosed by a kind of a stiff fibrous tissue. The notochord appears during the embryonic stages of all chordates. Now, some chordates, such as the invertebrates, still retain the notochord into adulthood, but in the vertebrates, a more complex skeleton develops to replace the notochord, and the notochord kind of disappears. Then there's also a dorsal hollow nerve cord. So in chordate embryos, a nerve cord develops from the ectoderm. So once again, another one of our germ tissue layers. So the ectoderm basically rolls into a tube to create this hollow nerve cord. Other animal phyla have solid nerve cords. So having a hollow one is kind of unique to chordates. The placement of the nerve cord is also unique. The nerve cord is located beside the notochord dorsally and runs parallel to the notochord. So most other animals have a nerve cord, but it's located on the ventral surface, the belly of the animal. So the nerve cord of the embryo develops typically into the central nervous system, which includes the brain and the spinal cord. Then we have pharyngeal gill slits. So at some point in their life, chordates possess pharyngeal gill slits. Like the name says, these slits arise from the pharynx, and the pharynx is part of the digestive tract that lies just behind the mouth. These slits are a way for water that enters through the mouth to be flushed out before it gets to the rest of the digestive tract. In adult chordates, these slits can be used for suspension feeding, such as in the tunicates are invertebrates, or they've been modified for a variety of other respiratory functions, such as gills in fish and the juvenile stages of amphibians. In reptiles, birds, and mammals, it's become transformed into the eustachian tube and middle ear chamber. So the eustachian tube is a very narrow tube between the middle ear and the pharynx, and it serves to kind of equalize pressure on both sides of the eardrum. The post-anal tail, most chordates have a tail that extends beyond the anus. In humans, this tail is what we call our coccyx. So we said it was a vestigial trait that we have, but most chordates at some point, whether it's during an embryonic or during larval stages, have a post-anal tail. So these four characteristics occur at some point in the animal's life. A lot of times, as we said, just usually during embryonic development. So we said there are a few invertebrate groups within the phylum Chordata. So we've got the tunicates and the lancelets. Tunicates are also called sea squirts because if you nag the poor thing, it's going to squirt out water. And I used to do this with my class. I would bring in some sea squirts and then kind of pass them around, and sure enough, one of the sea squirts would squirt out some water and they'd get wet. So the sea squirt, or the tunicate, is marine, meaning it lives in salt water, and it's usually found attached to docks or anything that's kind of in the water that they can attach to. And they basically remain there during their adult lives, but they do have a planktonic form. They do have kind of larval stages, and there are some that are planktonic, such as salps, that can float around. So these guys are small, typically suspension feeders. They have the pharyngeal slits, like we talked about. Okay, lancelets are kind of translucent marine animals. They kind of look like an eel or a very tiny eel because they're only a few centimeters long, and they're very long and blade shaped, which is how they got their name, because they look like a little lance. There's only about 20 species of them, so not a lot of them out there. And they kind of retain their notochord into adulthood. So these guys just kind of bury themselves in the sand and then feed off of what they find in the sand. Then we're going to move on to our vertebrate groups. So we're covering groups that have a vertebral column as adults, and we'll start with the jawless fish. So there are a lot of different groups of fish. So they're some of the oldest vertebrate fossils that we have. So they've been around for a very long period of time, and they've done a lot of evolving and diversifying into a lot of different species. Plus, if you think about it, 72% of the earth is covered by water, so they've got a pretty big environment to be able to diversify within. So the first group is the jawless fish, and that we might also call them agnathans. So that means without a jaw. So A is always without or none, so it's without a jaw. And this is the main characteristic of this class. They do not have a jaw. What they have is kind of a circular mouth region, and they use that to suck off of their prey. So we have lampreys that belong to this group. So they suck the blood of their prey, and they have tooth-like plates on a tongue that abrade basically a hole in the skin of their prey. So they kind of latch onto the prey and then use their rasping tongue to make a hole in their prey, and then they just kind of suck out the blood. Hagfish also belong to this group, and they are more scavengers, but they also have a tongue with teeth on it, and these guys produce lots and lots of slime. So you'll have to Google videos of hagfish just to see how much slime they produce. But they are also jawless fish. So these are fish that lacked paired appendages, so they do not have paired fins. They do not have pectoral and pelvic fins like other fish do, and they have a cartilaginous skeleton, so they don't have a bony skeleton. It's just cartilage, which is a very elastic type of tissue. And that's about all we're going to say on the fish for right now. I'm going to pause or stop this video so that we can talk about the next group, the hinged jaw group. So you can imagine what has the most famous set of jaws as far as fish go.